The mahogany conference room door slammed shut behind me with a finality that echoed through the 15th floor of Summit Financial Services. My hands trembled as I clutched the stack of client files that had just been dismissed as receptionist, busy work, by my supervisor. But what happened next in that same conference room 30 minutes later would change not just my life, but the entire power structure of the company I'd served faithfully for 8 years. Mom? The voice that spoke those words belonged to a man in an impeccably tailored navy suit, a man who had just been introduced to our entire staff as our new chief executive officer. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my supervisor's coffee cup hitting the floor and shattering into a dozen pieces. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Carter, and until that Thursday afternoon, in downtown Chicago, I was invisible. Not literally, of course, but in every way that mattered in the corporate world of Summit Financial Services. For 8 years, I had been the first face clients saw when they stepped off the elevator, the voice that answered their calls, the woman who somehow managed to keep track of 50 different schedules while being told repeatedly that my opinions didn't matter because I was just a receptionist. The morning that would change everything started like any other Tuesday in late October. The autumn wind whipped off Lake Michigan with a bitter intensity that seemed to seep through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown office building. I arrived at 7:30, a full hour before anyone else, just as I had every morning for the past 8 years. The security guard, Marcus, nodded his usual greeting as I badged into the building. He was one of the few people in the building who treated me like an actual human being rather than office furniture. "Morning, Linda. Coffee's fresh in the lobby if you want to grab some before heading up," he said with genuine warmth. Marcus was probably the only person in the entire building who knew that I had an MBA from Northwestern, earned back when my late husband David was still alive, and our dreams felt achievable. But life has a way of reshuffling your deck when you least expect it. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me the same view it always did. Lake Michigan stretching endlessly to the horizon, dotted with early morning joggers and the occasional brave soul attempting to fish despite the temperature. David used to say that the lake reminded him of possibilities, endless and ever-changing. I tried to hold on to that sentiment as the elevator dinged and opened into the reception area that had become both my kingdom and my prison. Summit Financial Services occupied the entire 15th floor, a testament to the success Tom Garrison had built over the past 20 years. The reception area was my domain. Elegant mahogany furniture, tasteful artwork featuring Chicago landmarks, and a view that visiting clients often commented on before they were whisked away to meetings I wasn't important enough to attend. My desk sat strategically positioned so I could see everyone coming and going, a hub of activity that I orchestrated with precision despite being told regularly that anyone could do my job. I had barely settled into my chair and powered up my computer when I heard the distinctive click of Brenda Mitchell's heels on the marble flooring. Brenda was my immediate supervisor, the office manager who had made it her personal mission to ensure I understood my place in the company hierarchy. At 38, she was 7 years younger than me, but wielded her authority like a sword, particularly when it came to keeping me in what she considered my proper place. "Linda, I need you to understand something," Brenda announced without preamble, not bothering with pleasantries like "good morning" or "how was your evening." She stood beside my desk with her arms crossed, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against her sleeve. "We're going to have some very important visitors today, and I need to make sure you understand the boundaries of your position." I looked up from the morning schedule I had been reviewing, noting the appointments, meetings, and conference calls that would require my coordination throughout the day. "Of course, Brenda. Is there something specific you need me to handle differently?" Her smile was condescending in the way that had become painfully familiar over the years. Brenda had a particular talent for making simple conversations feel like lectures designed to put me in my place. The board of directors will be here this morning for a very important announcement. There will be executives from other companies, potential investors, and media representatives. Your job is to answer phones, direct people to the correct conference room, and stay out of the way. This is not the time for you to try to insert yourself into conversations or offer opinions about company matters. The implications stung, though I had grown accustomed to such comments over the years. Brenda seemed to believe that my role as receptionist meant I was incapable of understanding anything beyond the most basic tasks, despite the fact that I had been handling complex scheduling, client communications, and administrative coordination since before she was hired 4 years ago. "I understand," I replied evenly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing how her words affected me. "I've prepared the executive conference room, confirmed catering arrangements, and updated the visitor log system. Is there anything else you need me to coordinate?" Brenda's expression tightened slightly. She seemed disappointed that I hadn't provided her with an opportunity to deliver a more pointed lecture. "Just remember, Linda, this is a big day for the company. Important decisions are being made by important people. Your job is to smile, answer phones, and remember that you're just the receptionist. Don't try to be something you're not." The words hit their intended target. Brenda had a particular gift for finding the exact phrasing that would remind me of my perceived limitations, while maintaining plausible deniability if anyone questioned her treatment of me. After all, she was simply clarifying my job responsibilities, wasn't she? As Brenda walked away, her heels clicking decisively toward her office, I found myself gripping my coffee mug a little tighter than necessary. The truth was, I had opinions about company matters. I saw how clients reacted to different approaches, heard their concerns during phone calls, and understood the patterns in their needs better than many of the consultants who barely interacted with them. But expressing those observations had only resulted in reminders about staying in my lane and focusing on my actual job. The morning progressed with the usual rhythm of phone calls, visitor check-ins, and coordination between different departments. I scheduled conference rooms, arranged for additional catering when the guest list expanded, and fielded calls from clients who needed to reschedule appointments due to the day's special events. It was the kind of complex orchestration that required attention to detail, diplomatic communication skills, and the ability to solve problems quickly. But Brenda was right. To most people, I was just the receptionist. Around 10 o'clock, Tom Garrison emerged from his corner office looking unusually energetic for a man who had been contemplating retirement for the past 2 years. Tom was the kind of leader who remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, and genuinely seemed to care about creating a positive work environment. He was also, unfortunately, the kind of person who trusted his managers to treat their employees with the same respect he showed everyone. "Linda, how are we looking for the 11 o'clock announcement?" Tom asked, pausing beside my desk with the easy familiarity of someone who had grown comfortable with routine interactions over the years. "Everything's ready, Mr. Garrison," I assured him. "The executive conference room is set up for 30. People catering will arrive at 10:45, and I've confirmed attendance with all the board members and external guests. The press release has been loaded into the system for distribution immediately following your announcement." Tom smiled, the kind of genuine expression that reminded me why I had stayed with Summit Financial Services despite the daily frustrations of my position. "Excellent work, as always. This is going to be an exciting day for the company. Change can be challenging, but I think you'll find our new leadership very impressive." New leadership. The phrase sent a small chill through me, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Change in a corporate environment often meant restructuring, and restructuring usually meant that people in positions like mine were considered expendable. I had survived multiple rounds of cost-cutting over the years, but each time left me feeling more vulnerable and more aware of how precarious my position really was. "I'm sure it will be wonderful," I replied diplomatically, though privately, I wondered what these changes might mean for someone who was already considered invisible by much of the management team. As Tom headed toward the elevator to greet arriving board members, Diane Reynolds appeared beside my desk carrying a stack of financial reports and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Diane was one of the senior accountants, a woman about 10 years younger than me who had always treated me with professional respect and genuine friendliness. She was also one of the few people in the office who seemed to recognize that my job required more skill and knowledge than most people assumed. "Linda, have you heard anything about who's taking over from Tom?" Diane asked quietly, glancing around to make sure Brenda wasn't within earshot. "The rumors have been flying for weeks, but nobody seems to know anything concrete." I shook my head, grateful for the opportunity to have a normal conversation with someone who didn't feel the need to remind me of my place in the company hierarchy. Tom's been very tight-lipped about the whole process. I know the board has been interviewing candidates for months, but he hasn't shared any details with me. Diane leaned closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Carol in HR mentioned that they found someone with an incredible background. Apparently graduated from Harvard Business School, has international experience, and really impressed the..." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bored with his vision for expanding the company. She said Tom was practically glowing when he talked about the choice. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the catering team, who needed access to the executive conference room to set up for the announcement. I excused myself to coordinate with them, ensuring that everything would be perfectly arranged for what was clearly going to be a significant moment in the company's history. As I worked with the catering staff to arrange coffee service and pastries, I found myself wondering about this mysterious new CEO and what his leadership might mean for the company culture that Tom had worked so hard to create. By 10:45, the 15th floor was buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt since the early days of the company's major expansion 5 years earlier. Board members arrived in clusters, greeting each other with the kind of professional familiarity that comes from years of working together. External guests, other executives, potential partners, and a few journalists added to the sense of occasion. I checked each person against my master list, provided name tags and information packets, and directed them toward the executive conference room with the kind of seamless efficiency that 8 years of experience had taught me. Brenda emerged from her office looking particularly polished, having clearly put extra effort into her appearance for the day's events. She surveyed the controlled chaos of arriving guests with the satisfaction of someone who believed she was observing the successful execution of her own planning, despite the fact that I had handled the majority of the coordination myself. "Linda," she said, approaching my desk with an expression that managed to be both patronizing and warning simultaneously. "I want to remind you that your job today is to stay at your desk and handle any phone calls or late arrivals. Under no circumstances should you try to enter the conference room or participate in the announcement. This is executive-level business, and it's important that everyone understands their appropriate role." The dismissal was clear and, by now, familiar. Brenda seemed to take particular pleasure in these moments when she could emphasize the distance between my position and the important work happening around me. I nodded acknowledgement, having learned years ago that arguing with Brenda only provided her with additional opportunities to lecture me about my limitations. As the last of the invited guests made their way into the executive conference room, I found myself alone in the reception area for the first time since early morning. The sudden quiet felt almost surreal after hours of controlled activity. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Tom standing at the head of the table, preparing to make what was clearly going to be a significant announcement. Board members and guests had arranged themselves around the room, and there was an anticipatory energy that seemed to fill the space even from my distant vantage point. I tried to focus on routine tasks, organizing files, updating appointment schedules, responding to emails, but found myself repeatedly glancing toward the conference room. This announcement would determine the future direction of the company, where I had spent nearly a decade of my professional life. Despite Brenda's repeated reminders that such matters were above my pay grade, I cared deeply about Summit Financial Services and the people who worked here. The company had provided me with stability during the most difficult period of my life, and I had invested considerable emotional energy in its success, even if my contributions weren't officially recognized. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts, and reminding me of my primary responsibility during the announcement. A client needed to reschedule an appointment, a vendor had questions about an invoice, and Tom's wife called to confirm dinner plans for later in the week. Normal business continuing while extraordinary events unfolded just 20 feet away, separated by glass walls and the invisible barriers of corporate hierarchy. It was during one of these routine phone calls that I noticed a commotion in the conference room. Tom had stepped aside from the podium, and there seemed to be an expectant pause in the proceedings. Through the glass, I could see him gesturing toward the door, apparently introducing someone who had not yet entered the room. The guests turned their attention toward the entrance, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation that I could feel even from my position at the reception desk. The conference room door opened, and a tall man in an expensive navy suit stepped into the room. Even from a distance, there was something commanding about his presence, the kind of natural authority that made people pay attention without demanding it. He moved with confidence but not arrogance, acknowledging the assembled guests with professional courtesy while making his way toward the front of the room. Something about him seemed familiar, though I couldn't immediately place why. Perhaps it was simply the bearing of someone accustomed to leadership positions, or the way he carried himself with quiet competence. I found myself studying his profile through the glass walls, trying to understand why this stranger felt somehow recognizable. Tom returned to the podium and began what was clearly an introduction, though I couldn't hear the specific words through the conference room's soundproofing. I could see animated gestures, appreciative nods from the audience, and the kind of positive energy that suggested this announcement was being well received. The mystery executive stood beside Tom, waiting for his formal introduction with the kind of patience that suggested he was comfortable with such situations. As Tom continued his remarks, I tried to return my attention to work tasks, but found it difficult to concentrate. This moment felt significant in a way that extended beyond normal corporate transitions. Change was coming to Summit Financial Services, and despite my peripheral role in the company's operations, I couldn't shake the feeling that these changes would affect everyone, including the woman at the reception desk who was considered just a receptionist. The announcement continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. I could see enthusiastic responses from the audience, handshakes, and the kinds of conversations that suggested positive reception of whatever news was being shared. Through it all, the new executive maintained a professional demeanor that spoke of experience with high-stakes business situations. As the formal presentation concluded, I expected the guests to begin filtering out of the conference room for the networking reception that had been planned in the adjacent meeting space. Instead, Tom appeared to be making additional remarks, gesturing in a way that suggested he was sharing something particularly important or personal. The audience's attention remained focused, and there was an intimacy to the moment that suggested this was more than just a standard corporate announcement. It was then that disaster struck. Not the kind of dramatic disaster that makes headlines, but the sort of workplace humiliation that reveals character and changes relationships permanently. Brenda emerged from the conference room, her face flushed, with what appeared to be excitement, and perhaps a small amount of champagne from the celebratory toast that had apparently concluded the announcement. She approached my desk with the kind of energy that suggested she had something important to share, though her expression quickly shifted when she noticed that I was organizing a stack of client files that needed to be distributed to various departments later in the afternoon. "Linda, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Brenda asked, her voice carrying the sharp edge that usually preceded one of her lectures about appropriate boundaries and professional limitations. I looked up from the files, genuinely confused by the question. "I'm preparing the Henderson account documentation for tomorrow's client meeting, along with the quarterly reports that need to be distributed to the department heads. Is there something else you need me to handle?" Brenda's expression shifted to something approaching disbelief, as if I had just announced my intention to perform surgery or argue a case before the Supreme Court. "Those are confidential client files, Linda. Financial documentation that requires understanding of complex investment strategies and regulatory compliance. That's not receptionist work. That's professional analysis that should be handled by qualified staff members." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I had been managing client documentation, coordinating complex scheduling, and handling sensitive communications for 8 years. The Henderson account was one I had worked with personally, managing their appointment schedules, maintaining their contact information, and ensuring that their documentation was properly organized for efficient service delivery. I knew their account history, understood their investment preferences, and had developed a professional relationship with their primary contact that had lasted for years. "Brenda, I've managed the Henderson account coordination for the past 6 years," I replied carefully, trying to keep my voice level despite the frustration building inside me. "I understand their documentation requirements and have been handling their file organization with approval from Mr. Garrison since they became our client." Her laugh was brittle and dismissive, the kind of sound that was designed to make me feel foolish for even attempting to defend my competence. "Linda, you're just a receptionist. You answer phones and direct visitors to the appropriate offices. You don't have the qualifications or the authority to handle complex financial documentation, regardless of how long you've been filing papers. These files need to be managed by someone who actually understands what they contain." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar sting of being reduced to my job title rather than being recognized for my actual capabilities and contributions. But this time, something was different. Maybe it was the energy of change that had been building throughout the morning. Or maybe it was simply 8 years of accumulated frustration finally reaching a breaking point. "I have an MBA in Business Administration from Northwestern University," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the emotion building inside me. "I understand financial documentation, investment strategies, and client relationship management. I've been handling complex coordination and analysis for this company since before you were hired, and I've never made an error that compromised client service or company operations." The silence that followed was profound. Brenda stared at me as if I had just claimed to be an astronaut or a Nobel Prize winner. Her expression cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally settled on something approaching anger. "That's impossible," she said flatly. "If you had those qualifications, you wouldn't be working as a receptionist. You certainly wouldn't have stayed in a support position for 8 years if you were capable of professional-level work. I don't know why you're making up stories about your background, but it's inappropriate and frankly delusional." The conversation was attracting attention from other staff members who had begun emerging from the conference room following the conclusion of the announcement. I could see Diane watching our interaction with concern, and Carol from HR had paused near the elevator, with an expression that suggested she was debating whether to intervene. "I'm not making up anything," I replied, maintaining my composure despite feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "I took this position 8 years ago because I needed stable employment with benefits after my husband died unexpectedly. I stayed because this company provided security during a difficult time in my life, and because I genuinely cared about contributing to its success, even if my role wasn't recognized at the executive level." Brenda's expression had shifted to something approaching fury. The conversation had clearly moved beyond her expectation of a simple reminder about professional boundaries and had become something much more significant. She seemed to realize that other people were watching, which only appeared to intensify her need to reassert her authority and put me back in what she considered my proper place. "Linda, I don't care what stories you tell yourself about your background or qualifications," she said. her voice rising enough to ensure that our conversation was audible to anyone within 20 feet. "The reality is that you are just a receptionist. You answer phones, you schedule appointments, and you handle basic administrative tasks. You are not qualified to manage client files. You are not capable of understanding complex financial matters. And you certainly don't have the authority to make decisions about company operations." The humiliation was complete and public. Several staff members were now openly watching our interaction, and I could feel the weight of their attention like a physical presence. This was the moment Brenda had been building toward for years, the definitive establishment of my place in the company hierarchy, delivered with an audience to ensure that everyone understood the boundaries of my position and capabilities. But, as I stood there, feeling the familiar sting of professional dismissal and personal invalidation, something unexpected happened. The conference room door opened and Tom Garrison emerged, followed by the mystery executive who had been the focus of the morning's announcement. They were engaged in what appeared to be a continuation of their earlier conversation, walking toward the reception area with the kind of easy familiarity that suggested they had developed a comfortable working relationship. As they approached, I found myself looking directly at the new executive for the first time since he had entered the building. The recognition hit me like a lightning bolt, sudden and overwhelming and impossible to deny. The man walking beside Tom Garrison, the new CEO of Summit Financial Services, the executive with the impressive Harvard MBA and international experience, was my son, Michael. The recognition was so sudden and overwhelming that I felt my knees weaken. Michael Carter, my son, stood 20 feet away in an expensive Navy suit, discussing company strategy with Tom Garrison as if he belonged in this world of executive decisions and corporate leadership, which apparently he did. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the young man who used to call me every Sunday from wherever his consulting work had taken him with the polished executive who had just been introduced as the new CEO of Summit Financial Services. Michael had been working internationally for the past 5 years, building an impressive career with a global consulting firm that specialized in corporate restructuring and growth strategies. Our phone conversations had become less frequent as his responsibilities increased, but he had always been respectful about staying in touch despite his demanding schedule. He had mentioned being offered new opportunities, potential career changes, and the possibility of returning to Chicago permanently, but I had never imagined anything like this. As I watched him gesture toward the conference room, explaining something to Tom with the kind of animated enthusiasm that suggested genuine excitement about his new role, I felt a complex mixture of pride and panic. Pride, because my son had clearly achieved something remarkable, building the kind of career that I had once dreamed of for myself. Panic, because his presence here would inevitably reveal connections and relationships that I had kept private for very good reasons. Brenda was still speaking, her voice cutting through my shocked realization with continued reminders about my limitations and proper place in the company hierarchy. "I hope this conversation has helped clarify your position here, Linda. It's important that everyone understands their role and doesn't develop unrealistic expectations about their importance to company operations." I nodded absently, barely hearing her words as I watched Michael shake hands with several board members who had emerged from the conference room. He moved through these interactions with natural confidence, the kind of social ease that comes from years of high-level business relationships. Several people seemed to already know him, suggesting that his appointment had been preceded by extensive introduction and relationship building with key stakeholders. "Are you even listening to me?" Brenda demanded, her voice sharp with irritation, at my apparent distraction. "This is exactly the kind of attitude that demonstrates why you're not suited for anything beyond basic administrative tasks. You can't even focus on a simple conversation about job responsibilities." Before I could respond, Tom's voice carried across the reception area as he approached my desk with Michael beside him. "Linda, I'd like you to meet our new CEO, Michael Carter. Michael, this is Linda Carter, our receptionist. She's been with the company for 8 years and knows our operations better than almost anyone." The introduction hung in the air like a live wire. Tom's use of our shared last name was delivered without any apparent recognition of its significance, suggesting that he had never made the connection between his long-serving receptionist and his new executive. Michael's expression remained professionally neutral, though I caught a brief flicker in his eyes that suggested he was as surprised by this moment as I was. "Ms. Carter," Michael said formally, extending his hand with the kind of professional courtesy he would show to any employee. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I understand you've been an important part of keeping this company running smoothly." I shook his hand, marveling at how surreal it felt to engage in this formal introduction with the young man I had raised, supported through college, and celebrated with when he graduated from Harvard Business School. His grip was firm and confident, and his expression gave no indication that he was speaking to his mother, rather than a colleague he had just met. "Welcome to Summit Financial Services, Mr. Carter," I replied, matching his professional tone despite the emotional chaos I was experiencing internally. "I hope you'll find everything you need to make a successful transition into your new role." Brenda watched this exchange with the kind of attention that suggested she was cataloging every detail for future reference. The shared last name had clearly registered with her, though she seemed to be processing it as an interesting coincidence rather than evidence of any meaningful connection. After all, Carter was a common enough surname, and she had already established in her mind that I was someone whose background and connections were insignificant. "How interesting," Brenda interjected with the kind of bright tone that barely concealed her skepticism. "Carter is such a common name, isn't it? What are the odds of having two Carters in the same company, especially when one is our new CEO and the other is just our receptionist?" The emphasis on "just our receptionist" was deliberate and pointed, a reminder delivered as much for Michael's benefit as for mine. Brenda seemed determined to ensure that our new CEO understood the company hierarchy and didn't develop any misconceptions about the importance or capabilities of support staff members. Michael's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a subtle change that I recognized from years of watching him navigate challenging social situations. He had always possessed an innate sense of fairness and a particular sensitivity to people being treated dismissively or with disrespect. I could see him processing Brenda's comment and the attitude it represented. "I've found that titles don't always reflect the full scope of someone's contributions to an organization," Michael replied carefully, his tone remaining professional, but carrying an undertone that suggested he had formed some immediate impressions about workplace dynamics. Some of the most valuable insights about company operations often come from people who interact with clients and coordinate daily activities. Brenda's smile became strained as she realized that her attempt to establish appropriate boundaries had not landed as intended. Michael's response suggested a management philosophy that might not align with her preferred approach to employee hierarchies and role definitions. "Of course," she said quickly, attempting to recover her footing. "We certainly appreciate Linda's administrative contributions. She's very reliable for basic tasks like answering phones and scheduling appointments. It's just important that everyone understands their appropriate level of involvement in company decision-making." The conversation was interrupted by Carol Peterson from Human Resources, who approached our group with a professional smile and an agenda that suggested she had been waiting for an appropriate moment to join the discussion. "Mr. Carter, I hate to interrupt, but we have several administrative items to review when you have a few minutes," Carol said, addressing Michael with the kind of efficiency that characterized most of her interactions. "Employment paperwork, benefits, enrollment, and a few policy briefings that will help you get oriented to our specific procedures." Michael nodded acknowledgement, then turned back to Tom. "Should we continue our discussion in your office? I'd like to review the quarterly projections. You mentioned, and I have some questions about the client acquisition strategies that were outlined in the transition documents." As the group began to move toward Tom's corner office, I expected to return to my normal routine of phone calls, appointment scheduling, and the various administrative tasks that filled my days. Instead, I found myself the focus of Brenda's continued attention, her expression suggesting that our earlier conversation was far from concluded. "I hope you don't think that little exchange changes anything about your position here," she said quietly, ensuring that her words wouldn't carry to the departing executives. "Sharing a last name with our new CEO doesn't make you any more qualified for responsibilities beyond your current job description." The irony of her statement was almost overwhelming, but I couldn't reveal the truth about my relationship with Michael without potentially creating complications for his new position. Corporate environments could be challenging enough without the added complexity of family relationships, particularly when those relationships cross traditional hierarchy boundaries in unexpected ways. "I understand my role here," I replied diplomatically, though privately I was beginning to question whether I truly understood anything about my situation anymore. The arrival of my son as CEO had transformed Summit Financial Services from a predictable work environment into something far more complex and potentially volatile. Over the following days, I watched Michael settle into his new position with the kind of systematic approach that had characterized his academic and professional achievements throughout his life. He arrived early, stayed late, and seemed genuinely interested in understanding every aspect of the company's operations. He scheduled meetings with department heads, reviewed financial reports with the kind of detailed attention that impressed even the most skeptical staff members, and began implementing small changes that suggested a thoughtful approach to leadership. What struck me most was his genuine interest in understanding how different parts of the company functioned together. Unlike many executives who focused primarily on high-level strategy and financial performance, Michael seemed to recognize that effective leadership required understanding the practical realities of daily operations. He spent time with the accounting team, sat in on client meetings, and even asked questions about administrative procedures that most executives would consider beneath their attention. During this period, my interactions with Michael remained strictly professional and carefully neutral. We exchanged polite greetings when he passed through the reception area, and I provided him with the same courteous assistance I offered to all executives. To outside observers, we appeared to be exactly what Tom's introduction had suggested: a new CEO and a long-serving receptionist maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. But I began to notice small details that suggested Michael was paying attention to workplace dynamics in ways that went beyond typical executive concerns. He observed how staff members interacted with each other, seemed to notice when people were treated dismissively, and asked questions that indicated he was forming impressions about company culture that extended beyond official policies and procedures. It was during his second week that I began to realize how closely he was watching the way Brenda interacted with support staff, particularly with me. Several times I caught him observing our conversations from a distance, his expression thoughtful, in a way that suggested he was processing information and forming conclusions about management styles and employee treatment. The situation came to a head on a Thursday afternoon when Brenda decided to make what she clearly considered an important point about professional boundaries and appropriate workplace behavior. Michael had requested that I prepare a comprehensive client contact list for his review, a task that required accessing multiple databases and coordinating information from different departments. It was exactly the kind of complex administrative work that I had been handling successfully for years, but it also represented the type of responsibility that Brenda preferred to reserve for what she considered qualified staff members. "Linda, I need to speak with you about the assignment Mr. Carter gave you," Brenda announced, approaching my desk with the kind of determined expression that usually preceded her most pointed lectures about knowing my place in the company hierarchy. I looked up from the client database I had been organizing, noting the comprehensive contact information, service history, and relationship notes that would provide Michael with exactly the kind of detailed overview he had requested. The work required understanding of client relationships, analytical skills, and attention to detail, but it was also well within my established capabilities and experience. "Is there a problem with the client contact analysis?" I asked, genuinely curious about what objection she might have to work that was clearly within my skill set and had been directly requested by our CEO. Brenda's expression suggested that my question itself demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of appropriate workplace dynamics. The problem is that you're attempting to handle professional-level analysis that should be assigned to qualified staff members. Client relationship management requires understanding of complex business relationships, strategic thinking, and analytical capabilities that go beyond basic administrative tasks. Her criticism stung, particularly because it dismissed both my educational background and years of experience managing exactly these types of client relationships. I had developed personal connections with many of Summit's long-term clients, understood their business needs and preferences, and had been responsible for ensuring that their service experience met their expectations and supported their loyalty to the company. I've been managing client relationship coordination for 8 years, I replied carefully, trying to maintain professional composure despite my growing frustration. I understand our clients' businesses, their service preferences, and their relationship history with Summit Financial Services. Mr. Carter requested comprehensive information, and I'm providing exactly what he asked for. Brenda's laugh was sharp and dismissive, designed to make me feel foolish for suggesting that my work constituted anything beyond basic data entry. Linda, you answer their phone calls and schedule their appointments. That's not the same as understanding their business strategies or being capable of analyzing their relationship patterns. You're not qualified to provide strategic analysis to executive leadership. The conversation was taking place in the open reception area, making it visible and audible to anyone passing through the central workspace. Several staff members had paused their activities to observe our interaction, and I could feel the familiar heat of public humiliation beginning to build as Brenda continued her lecture about my limitations and inappropriate ambitions. You need to understand that there's a difference between administrative support and professional analysis, she continued, her voice rising slightly to ensure that her words carried to our growing audience. Just because our new CEO asked you to compile some contact information doesn't mean you're qualified to provide insights about client relationships or business strategy. That level of work requires education, experience, and analytical capabilities that go far beyond answering phones and filing paperwork. What happened next would replay in my memory for months afterward. As Brenda delivered her assessment of my capabilities and appropriate workplace boundaries, Michael emerged from the elevator having returned from a client meeting across town. He moved through the reception area with his usual professional efficiency, but I could see him taking in the scene. Brenda standing over my desk delivering what was clearly a public lecture, several staff members watching with uncomfortable expressions, and me sitting behind my desk, feeling the familiar sting of professional dismissal. Michael paused near the edge of our conversation, his expression neutral, but his attention clearly focused on Brenda's words. She seemed to notice his presence and appeared to view it as an opportunity to demonstrate her management effectiveness and ensure that our new CEO understood appropriate workplace hierarchies. "Mr. Carter, I'm glad you're here," Brenda said, turning toward him with the kind of bright professional smile she reserved for interactions with executive leadership. "I was just explaining to Linda that the client analysis work you requested should really be handled by someone with appropriate qualifications. I'd be happy to reassign the project to a staff member who has the background necessary to provide you with professional-level insights." Michael listened to her suggestion with the kind of careful attention that I had learned to recognize as his way of processing information before making decisions. His expression remained professionally neutral, but something in his posture suggested that he was forming conclusions about more than just work assignments. "What specifically concerns you about Linda's qualifications for this project?" he asked, his tone remaining courteous but carrying an undertone that suggested genuine interest in understanding her perspective. Brenda seemed pleased by the question, apparently interpreting it as validation of her concerns and an opportunity to demonstrate her management insight. "Well, Client relationship analysis requires understanding of complex business strategies, analytical thinking, and the ability to identify patterns that might not be obvious to someone without appropriate educational background. Linda is excellent at administrative tasks, but this type of strategic analysis really requires someone with business education and professional experience in relationship management. The irony of her statement was overwhelming. She was describing exactly the qualifications I possessed: the MBA from Northwestern, years of professional experience, and extensive knowledge of client relationships developed through nearly a decade of direct interaction with Summit's customer base. But she was delivering this assessment to my son, who knew better than anyone else my educational background, professional capabilities, and analytical skills. Michael nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her perspective carefully. "I see. And what educational background do you think would be appropriate for this type of analysis?" Brenda seemed energized by his apparent interest in her assessment. "Ideally, someone with a business degree, perhaps an MBA, and experience in client relationship management or strategic analysis. The kind of background that provides understanding of complex business relationships and the analytical tools necessary to identify meaningful patterns and insights." The description was so perfectly aligned with my actual qualifications that I had to struggle to maintain my composure. Brenda was essentially arguing that I was unqualified to do work that aligned exactly with my educational and professional background, while speaking to the son who had celebrated with me when I earned my MBA and had frequently sought my advice on business decisions throughout his own career development. "That makes sense," Michael agreed, his tone remaining neutral. "Educational background and relevant experience would certainly be important for strategic analysis work. Linda, what's your educational background?" The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Brenda looked satisfied, apparently expecting that my response would validate her assessment and demonstrate the appropriateness of her management decisions. Several staff members who had been observing our conversation seemed to lean in slightly, curious about how I would respond to this direct inquiry about my qualifications. I met Michael's gaze directly, seeing in his eyes a combination of professional curiosity and something deeper that suggested he understood the significance of this moment. "I have an MBA in Business Administration from Northwestern University, with a concentration in strategic management and client relations. I also have over 15 years of professional experience in business analysis and relationship management, including nearly 8 years of direct client interaction and coordination, here at Summit Financial Services." The silence that followed was profound. Brenda stared at me as if I had just claimed to have walked on the moon, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching anger. Several of the observing staff members looked genuinely surprised, and I realized that, despite working alongside these people for years, most of them had no idea of my actual educational background or professional qualifications. "That's impossible," Brenda said flatly, her voice carrying the kind of certainty that suggested she couldn't process information that contradicted her established assumptions about my capabilities and background. "If you had those qualifications, you wouldn't be working as a receptionist. You certainly wouldn't have stayed in a support position for 8 years if you were capable of professional-level work." Michael's expression had shifted subtly, and I could see him processing not just the information about my background, but also Brenda's response to that information. His next question was delivered with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was gathering information for purposes that went beyond simple curiosity. "Linda, if you don't mind me asking, what led you to take a receptionist position with your educational background and experience?" The question required me to share personal information that I had kept private throughout my years at Summit Financial Services, but the current situation seemed to demand honesty about circumstances that had shaped my career decisions. "My husband died unexpectedly 8 years ago," I replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite the emotional difficulty of discussing this period of my life in a professional setting. I needed stable employment with benefits while I rebuilt my life and financial security. The receptionist position at Summit provided that stability, and I discovered that I genuinely cared about contributing to the company's success, even if my role wasn't at the executive level I had previously experienced. The explanation seemed to resonate with several of the staff members who had been listening to our conversation. I could see understanding and even respect in some of their expressions, as if my circumstances provided context that made my career decisions make sense rather than seeming like evidence of limited capabilities. Brenda, however, seemed increasingly agitated by information that contradicted her established narrative about my qualifications and appropriate role within the company. "This is ridiculous," she said, her professional composure beginning to crack under the weight of having her assumptions challenged so directly. "Educational credentials from years ago don't qualify someone for strategic analysis work, especially when they've been working in administrative support for nearly a decade." Michael listened to her objection with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the conversation, but I could see something hardening in his expression. When he spoke, his voice carried a tone of authority that I had never heard him use in our personal relationship, but that suggested he had developed considerable skill in executive leadership. "Actually, Brenda, I think that's exactly the kind of background and experience that would be valuable for understanding client relationships and business operations. Someone with business education who has also spent years interacting directly with our clients and coordinating our daily operations would have insights that might not be available to people who work only at the strategic level." The validation was both professional and personal, though delivered in a way that maintained appropriate workplace boundaries. Michael was defending my qualifications and capabilities without revealing our personal relationship, establishing his expectations for how employees should be evaluated and treated within the company he now led. Brenda's expression suggested that she was beginning to realize that this conversation had not developed in the direction she had anticipated. Her attempt to demonstrate effective management by highlighting my limitations had instead resulted in a public discussion of my qualifications that contradicted everything she had assumed about my background and capabilities. "Of course, Mr. Carter," she said quickly, attempting to recover her professional footing. "I certainly didn't mean to suggest that educational background isn't important. I was simply concerned about ensuring that you receive the highest quality analysis for such important strategic work." Michael nodded acknowledgement of her explanation, but his tone when he responded suggested that he had formed some definitive conclusions about the situation. "I appreciate your concern for work quality, Brenda. However, I'm confident that Linda's educational background and extensive experience with our clients make her well qualified to provide the analysis I requested. I'd like her to continue with the project as originally assigned." The decision was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made it clear this was not a suggestion or the opening of a negotiation. Michael had made an executive determination about work assignments and employee capabilities, and his tone suggested that further discussion of Linda's qualifications would not be welcome or productive. As the conversation concluded and the small crowd of observers began to disperse, I found myself alone at my desk with a stack of client files and a completely transformed understanding of my position within Summit Financial Services. In the space of a single conversation, I had gone from being dismissed as just a receptionist to having my educational background and professional capabilities validated by the company's CEO. But the most significant change wasn't in how others might perceive my qualifications. It was in how I was beginning to see myself and my potential contributions to the company, where I had spent 8 years accepting a role that utilized only a fraction of my actual capabilities and experience. For the first time in nearly a decade, I felt the stirring of professional ambition and the possibility that my career story might not be finished after all. The weekend that followed Michael's public validation of my qualifications felt like stepping into an alternate universe. For the first time in 8 years, I found myself thinking about work in terms of possibilities rather than limitations. The client analysis project he had assigned me represented more than just a task. It was an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that had been dormant for far too long. I spent Saturday morning at my kitchen table surrounded by client files, financial reports, and legal pads covered with notes. The work was intellectually stimulating in a way that reminded me why I had originally pursued business education. As I analyzed relationship patterns, identified trends in client needs, and developed strategic recommendations, I felt muscles in my mind that had been unused for years, beginning to strengthen and stretch. The Henderson account, which Brenda had dismissed as too complex for my understanding, revealed fascinating patterns when examined through the lens of strategic analysis. Their investment preferences had evolved significantly over the past 3 years, suggesting opportunities for expanded services that could benefit both the client and Summit Financial Services. Similar patterns emerged across multiple accounts, indicating systematic opportunities that had apparently gone unrecognized by the company's current client management approach. By Sunday evening, I had compiled a comprehensive analysis that went far beyond the simple contact list Michael had originally requested. The document included relationship mapping, trend analysis, growth opportunity identification, and strategic recommendations for improving client retention and expanding service offerings. It was the kind of work I had done regularly in my previous professional life, and rediscovering my capability for this level of analysis felt like reconnecting with a part of myself that had been buried under years of answering phones and scheduling appointments. Monday morning arrived with an energy that felt different from the routine I had maintained for nearly a decade. I dressed more carefully than usual, selecting a professional blazer that I hadn't worn to work in years. As I reviewed my analysis, one final time before leaving for the office, I realized that I was genuinely excited about presenting work that represented my actual capabilities, rather than simply fulfilling basic administrative requirements. The elevator ride to the 15th floor provided the same view of Lake Michigan that I had observed thousands of times before. But this morning the water seemed to reflect possibilities rather than serving as a reminder of dreams deferred. When the doors opened into the reception area that had been my professional world for 8 years, I felt like I was seeing it through new eyes. Marcus, the security guard, noticed the change immediately. "You're looking particularly sharp this morning. Linda, something special happening today?" His observation reminded me that transformation often begins with internal shifts that become visible to others before we fully recognize them ourselves. "Just feeling ready for whatever the day brings," I replied, and for the first time in years, I genuinely meant it. The morning progressed with unusual energy throughout the office. Several staff members approached my desk with comments about the previous week's conversation with Brenda, offering supportive words that suggested my educational background had surprised and impressed people who had worked alongside me for years without knowing my qualifications. Diane Reynolds stopped by early in the morning with her typical warm smile, but her expression carried additional elements of respect and curiosity. "Linda, I had no idea about your MBA from Northwestern. That's incredibly impressive. I keep thinking about all the insights you must have about our operations, seeing everything from your position here." Her observation highlighted something that I was beginning to recognize myself: the unique perspective that came from understanding both the strategic elements of business operations and the practical realities of daily implementation. My position at the reception desk had provided me with visibility into every aspect of the company's functioning, from client relationships to internal dynamics to operational challenges that might not be apparent to people working within specific departments. "Thank you, Diane. It's interesting how different types of experience can provide complementary insights into how businesses function," I replied, beginning to articulate ideas that had been forming in my mind over the weekend. Sometimes the view from the center of operations reveals patterns that might not be visible from other vantage points. Our conversation was interrupted by Carol Peterson from Human Resources, who approached with the kind of purposeful expression that suggested she had something specific to discuss. Carol had always been professional and fair in our interactions, but this morning her demeanor carried additional warmth that suggested recent events had influenced her perception of our professional relationship. "Linda, do you have a few minutes to chat in my office?" Carol asked. "I'd like to discuss some developments that might be of interest to you." The invitation was unexpected, but intriguing. I followed Carol to her office, noting the comfortable professional environment she had created with tasteful artwork and plants that softened the corporate atmosphere. She gestured for me to take a seat in one of the chairs arranged for confidential conversations. "I hope you don't mind me bringing this up directly," Carol began, "but I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding your educational background and professional experience. It occurred to me that Summit Financial Services might not be utilizing your capabilities in the most effective way possible." Her observation echoed thoughts that had been developing in my own mind, but hearing it articulated by someone in human resources felt significant. Carol was known for her strategic thinking about personnel development and organizational effectiveness, and her interest in my situation suggested possibilities that I hadn't previously considered. "I appreciate you mentioning that," I replied, carefully, uncertain about how much I should reveal about my own evolving thoughts regarding my role at the company. I've certainly wondered sometimes whether there might be opportunities to contribute in different ways, but I've also been grateful for the stability my current position has provided. Carol nodded understandingly. "Stability is important, especially given the circumstances that brought you to this role. But I've been reviewing our organizational structure and thinking about upcoming changes that might create opportunities for someone with your background and experience." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Carol's office door. Michael appeared in the doorway, dressed in the kind of impeccably tailored suit that had become his standard professional uniform, carrying a folder that I recognized as containing my client analysis work. "Carol, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was hoping to speak with Linda about the project she completed for me," Michael said, his tone maintaining the professional courtesy that characterized all of our workplace interactions. "I've reviewed her analysis, and I have some questions and observations I'd like to discuss." The timing felt significant, though I couldn't determine whether it was coincidental or whether Michael had been looking for me and discovered my location through inquiry. Carol seemed pleased by his arrival, as if his presence supported points she had been preparing to make. "Actually, Michael, this timing is perfect," Carol said. "I was just discussing with Linda some thoughts about organizational development and making better use of our employees' qualifications and capabilities." Michael's expression shifted to one of professional interest, though I caught a brief flicker in his eyes that suggested he understood the broader implications of Carol's statement. "That sounds like exactly the kind of strategic thinking that will help Summit Financial Services continue growing and improving." He turned his attention to me, holding up the folder containing my analysis. "Linda, I've had a chance to review your client relationship analysis, and I have to say, it's exceptional work. The insights you've identified about relationship patterns and growth opportunities go far beyond what I originally requested." The praise felt both professionally validating and personally meaningful, though Michael's delivery maintained the appropriate boundaries for our workplace relationship. I could see Carol taking note of his assessment, and her expression suggested that this feedback supported whatever recommendations she had been preparing to make. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I found the work intellectually engaging, and I'm glad the analysis provides useful insights for strategic planning," I replied, matching his professional tone despite the complex emotions I was experiencing. Michael opened the folder and referenced specific pages of my analysis. "Your identification of cross-selling opportunities within the Henderson account alone could potentially increase revenue by 15 to 20%. The relationship mapping you've developed provides strategic insights that I haven't seen in any of the reports prepared by our current client management team." His assessment was delivered with the kind of specific, detailed feedback that demonstrated he had genuinely studied my work rather than simply offering polite acknowledgement. Carol was clearly impressed by both the quality of work he was describing and the thoroughness of his review. "Michael, this reinforces something I was just discussing with Linda," Carol interjected. "It seems like we might have an employee whose capabilities are significantly underutilized in her current role. Have you given any thought to organizational restructuring that might better align people's qualifications with their responsibilities?" The question represented exactly the kind of strategic personnel discussion that could transform my professional situation, but it also created potential complications given the hidden family relationship that Michael and I were maintaining. I found myself holding my breath as I waited for his response. Michael considered Carol's question with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested he understood its significance. "I think that's exactly the kind of strategic personnel development that successful companies need to prioritize. When we have employees with advanced qualifications and proven capabilities, we should be finding ways to utilize those strengths effectively." His response was professionally appropriate while also suggesting openness to the kind of changes that Carol was proposing. I could feel the conversation moving toward possibilities that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. "What type of role restructuring were you thinking about?" Michael asked Carol, though his gaze remained fixed on me in a way that suggested he was genuinely interested in my response as well as Carol's recommendations. Carol seemed energized by his receptiveness to her suggestions. "Well, Linda's background in strategic management and client relations, combined with her extensive knowledge of our operations and client base, seems perfectly suited for a client relationship management position. We could create a role that utilizes her analytical capabilities while building on the relationships she's already developed." The suggestion represented exactly the kind of professional opportunity that I had stopped allowing myself to imagine. A position that would utilize my education, experience, and knowledge while building on the client relationships I had maintained and developed over 8 years at Summit Financial Services. "That sounds like it could benefit both Linda and the company," Michael replied thoughtfully. "What would such a position look like in terms of responsibilities and reporting structure?" As Carol and Michael discussed the practical elements of creating a new position that would utilize my qualifications, I found myself processing the surreal nature of listening to my son and my HR director plan a career advancement that would transform my professional life. The conversation felt both professionally appropriate and deeply personal, representing possibilities that had seemed impossible just days earlier. "I think the position should report directly to executive leadership," Carol continued. "Given the strategic nature of client relationship analysis and the importance of maintaining strong connections with our customer base, someone in this role would need access to high-level information and the authority to implement relationship management strategies." Michael nodded agreement. "Client relationships are fundamental to our continued growth and success. Having someone with Linda's combination of analytical capabilities and operational knowledge focused on that area could provide significant competitive advantages." The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Carol and Michael developing detailed specifications for a client relationship manager position that seemed designed specifically for my background and experience. As they talked, I realized that this conversation represented more than just a potential job change. It was the first time in 8 years that my professional capabilities were being discussed in terms of strategic value rather than administrative limitations. When the meeting concluded, Michael asked me to remain behind for a few additional minutes to discuss the client analysis project in more detail. After Carol left to begin preparing formal documentation for the proposed position, we were alone in her office for the first time since his arrival at Summit Financial Services. "Mom?" he said quietly, his professional demeanor softening into something more personal and familial. "I had no idea what you've been dealing with here. Watching that woman dismiss your qualifications and treat you like you're incapable of analytical thinking, it was infuriating." The shift from formal workplace interaction to personal conversation felt both relieving and emotionally overwhelming. For the first time in weeks, I was talking to my son rather than maintaining professional boundaries with the company's CEO. I never told you about the specifics of my work environment because I didn't want you to worry or feel like you needed to intervene in my career decisions, I replied honestly. I chose this position for the stability it provided during a difficult time, and I stayed because it met my needs even if it didn't challenge my capabilities. Michael's expression reflected a mixture of concern, pride, and determination that reminded me of the young man who had always stood up for people he believed were being treated unfairly. Well, things are going to change now. That analysis you completed demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking that this company needs, and I intend to make sure your capabilities are recognized and utilized appropriately. His words carried both personal affection and professional commitment, suggesting that my advancement within the company would be supported by merit-based evaluation rather than favoritism. The distinction was important for maintaining the integrity of both our professional relationship and the organizational changes that were being proposed. I appreciate that, Michael, but I want to make sure that any opportunities I'm offered are based on my qualifications and performance rather than our family relationship, I said, voicing concerns that had been developing as I processed the morning's conversations. Michael smiled, the expression combining personal warmth with professional respect. Mom, after reading that analysis and watching how you've handled yourself in challenging situations over the past few weeks, I can guarantee that any advancement you receive will be completely merit-based. Your work speaks for itself. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on Carol's office door. Diane Reynolds appeared with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with poorly concealed excitement. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Linda, there's someone here to see you. A client who specifically asked to speak with you about their account coordination. The interruption felt significant, representing the kind of direct client relationship that had developed over my years of managing their communications and service coordination. As we returned to the reception area, I noticed that several staff members seemed to be watching my interactions with increased attention and interest, as if recent revelations about my background had changed their perception of my role within the company. The client who had requested to speak with me was Margaret Stevens, the primary contact for one of Summit's longest-standing corporate accounts. Margaret and I had developed a professional relationship over the past 5 years that went beyond simple appointment scheduling to include substantive discussions about her company's financial planning needs and service preferences. Linda, I hope you don't mind me stopping by without an appointment, Margaret said warmly. But I wanted to discuss some changes in our service needs, and you're the person who best understands our account history and preferences. Her request represented exactly the kind of client relationship that my analysis had identified as an opportunity for expanded services and deeper engagement. As we talked, I found myself drawing on both my analytical insights and my knowledge of her company's evolving needs to suggest services and approaches that could better support their financial planning objectives. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes and concluded with Margaret requesting a formal proposal for expanded services that aligned perfectly with the growth opportunities I had identified in my strategic analysis. As she prepared to leave, she made a comment that would prove to be more significant than either of us realized at the time. Linda, I've always appreciated how well you understand our business and our needs. It's rare to find someone who combines that level of analytical insight with genuine personal attention to client relationships. I hope Summit Financial Services recognizes what an asset you are. Her words were overheard by several staff members, including Brenda, who had emerged from her office with an expression that suggested she had been monitoring the client interaction with considerable interest and growing concern. As Margaret left the building, Brenda approached my desk with the kind of determined expression that usually preceded her most pointed lectures about appropriate professional boundaries. Linda, I hope you understand that individual client meetings should be coordinated through appropriate channels, Brenda began, her tone carrying the familiar edge that suggested she viewed my interaction with Margaret as somehow inappropriate or exceeding my authority. Her comment felt particularly ironic, given that Margaret had specifically requested to speak with me, had initiated the conversation based on her assessment of my understanding of her company's needs, and had concluded by requesting expanded services that could generate significant additional revenue for Summit Financial Services. Margaret Stevens has been working with me on account coordination for 5 years, I replied calmly. She requested this conversation specifically because of her familiarity with my understanding of her company's service needs and account history. Brenda's expression suggested that my response had not satisfied her concerns about maintaining appropriate workplace hierarchies and role definitions. Client relationship management requires specific training and qualifications, Linda. Even if clients request to speak with you personally, those conversations should be facilitated by someone with appropriate credentials in financial planning and strategic consultation. The irony of her statement was overwhelming, given that I possessed exactly the educational background and professional experience she was describing as necessary for client relationship management. But before I could respond, Michael appeared beside our conversation with an expression that suggested he had been observing the interaction and had decided to intervene. "Actually, Brenda," Michael said, his tone carrying quiet authority, "I think Linda's educational background in strategic management and client relations, combined with her extensive knowledge of our clients' needs and preferences, makes her exactly the right person to handle substantive client conversations." His intervention felt both professionally appropriate and personally supportive, establishing clear expectations about how client relationships should be managed, while also reinforcing his assessment of my qualifications and capabilities. Brenda seemed caught off guard by Michael's direct contradiction of her position. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I certainly didn't mean to suggest that Linda isn't capable of basic client communications. I was simply concerned about ensuring that complex financial discussions are handled by staff members with appropriate credentials." Michael's response was delivered with the kind of professional firmness that made his expectations unmistakably clear. "I think Linda's MBA in business administration and 15 years of professional experience provide exactly the credentials necessary for strategic client relationship management. In fact, I'm hoping she'll consider taking on expanded responsibilities in that area." The statement represented both professional validation and a subtle announcement about potential organizational changes that would elevate my role within the company. I could see Brenda processing the implications of Michael's words, her expression reflecting growing realization that the workplace dynamics she had worked to maintain were about to change significantly. As the conversation concluded and Brenda retreated to her office with a troubled expression, I found myself standing in the reception area that had been my professional world for 8 years. But everything felt transformed. Client relationships that I had been told were beyond my qualifications were being recognized as valuable strategic assets. Educational background that had been dismissed as irrelevant was being acknowledged as directly applicable to expanded responsibilities. Capabilities that had been underutilized were being identified as exactly what the company needed for continued growth and success. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, as if years of accumulated experience and suppressed potential were finally being recognized and valued appropriately. For the first time since David's death had forced me to rebuild my professional life, I felt like I was moving toward a future that honored both my capabilities and my aspirations rather than simply providing security and stability. But I also sensed that the changes beginning to unfold would create challenges and conflicts that extended beyond simple role restructuring. Brenda's resistance to acknowledging my qualifications suggested that she viewed my advancement as a threat to her own position and authority. The workplace dynamics that had allowed her to maintain dismissive attitudes toward support staff were being challenged by leadership that expected different standards of employee treatment and professional recognition. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself fielding questions and comments from colleagues who seemed genuinely interested in understanding more about my background and potential new role within the company. The conversations felt both validating and slightly surreal, representing a level of professional recognition that I had stopped expecting, but had never entirely stopped hoping for. The tension that had been building over the past several weeks reached its breaking point on a Wednesday morning in early December. The Chicago skyline was shrouded in the kind of heavy gray clouds that promised snow, and the atmosphere inside, Summit Financial Services, felt equally charged with impending change. I had been working in my newly created role as client relationship manager for 3 weeks, splitting my time between strategic analysis projects and maintaining the reception duties that ensured continuity during the transition period. The dual responsibilities had been challenging but invigorating, allowing me to demonstrate my analytical capabilities while maintaining the client relationships that had developed over 8 years. Several major accounts had already expressed enthusiasm about the expanded services I was able to offer, and the preliminary results suggested that the organizational changes were producing exactly the kind of improved client engagement that Michael and Carol had anticipated. However, the success of my new position had intensified Brenda's resistance to the changing workplace dynamics. Her comments had become increasingly pointed, her supervision more micromanaging, and her attitude toward me had shifted from condescending dismissal to something approaching active hostility. It was as if my professional advancement represented a personal threat to her authority and status within the company hierarchy. The morning's crisis began when Thomas Whitfield, the CEO of our largest corporate client, arrived unannounced requesting an immediate meeting about concerns regarding his company's service coordination. Thomas was known throughout the financial services industry as a demanding but fair executive who expected excellence in all professional relationships. His unexpected appearance at Summit Financial Services, clearly agitated and insisting on speaking with senior management, sent immediate ripples of concern throughout the 15th floor. I was reviewing quarterly client retention reports when Thomas stepped off the elevator, his expression stern and his demeanor suggesting serious dissatisfaction with some aspect of our service delivery. His assistant followed behind him, carrying files and looking equally tense about whatever issue had prompted this unscheduled visit. "I need to speak with Tom Garrison immediately," Thomas announced without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the reception area stop what they were doing and pay attention. "We have a significant problem with our service coordination that requires immediate executive attention." The timing was particularly unfortunate because Tom was attending a board meeting at our corporate offices across town, and Michael was reviewing acquisition proposals in his office with the door closed for privacy. I quickly assessed the situation, recognizing that Thomas's agitation required immediate attention from someone capable of addressing his concerns substantively, rather than simply scheduling a future appointment. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm Linda Carter, the client relationship manager for your account," I said, approaching him with professional confidence while maintaining the respectful tone appropriate for such an important client relationship. "Mr. Garrison is currently in meetings, but I'm familiar with all aspects of your service coordination and would be happy to address your concerns immediately." Thomas studied me for a moment, his expression reflecting the kind of careful evaluation that successful executives use when assessing whether someone has the authority and capability to resolve complex problems. His company's account represented nearly 15% of Summit's annual revenue, making his satisfaction crucial to our continued business success. "Ms. Carter, I need someone who can make decisions and implement changes, not someone who will take notes and schedule follow-up meetings," Thomas replied directly, his tone making clear that he had no patience for bureaucratic delays or administrative deferral of substantive issues. "I understand completely, and I have the authority to address operational concerns and implement immediate solutions," I assured him, drawing on both my knowledge of his account history and my understanding of our service capabilities. "Would you prefer to discuss the issues privately in our client conference room?" Thomas nodded agreement, and I led him and his assistant to the smaller conference room that was typically used for confidential client discussions. As we walked, I could see Brenda watching our interaction with an expression of barely concealed alarm. The sight of me handling such an important client situation independently, without deferring to her supervision or requesting permission, clearly violated her expectations about appropriate workplace boundaries and authority structures. Once we were seated in the conference room, Thomas outlined a series of coordination failures that had occurred over the past month, resulting in missed deadlines, inadequate communication, and service delivery that fell significantly below the standards his company required. The problems he described were serious and legitimate, representing exactly the kind of operational breakdown that could damage long-term client relationships and potentially result in the loss of major accounts. As Thomas detailed each issue, I realized that the problem stemmed from miscommunication between different departments and a lack of centralized coordination for his complex service requirements. The account had multiple components managed by different teams, and the absence of integrated oversight had created gaps in service delivery that had accumulated into serious dissatisfaction. Mr. Whitfield, I can see exactly what's happened here, and I take full responsibility for ensuring these coordination issues are resolved immediately, I said, after he had finished outlining his concerns. Your account requires integrated management that ensures all service components work together seamlessly, and that level of coordination hasn't been consistently maintained. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting cautious interest in whether I could provide substantive solutions, rather than simply acknowledging the problems he had identified. What specifically are you proposing to address these issues? Over the next 40 minutes, I outlined a comprehensive account management restructuring that would centralize coordination responsibilities, establish clearer communication protocols, and implement oversight mechanisms to prevent future service gaps. The solution drew on my understanding of his company's operational preferences, my knowledge of Summit's service capabilities, and strategic management principles that could ensure consistent excellence in service delivery. Thomas asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, resource allocation, and quality assurance measures. His inquiries were sophisticated and demanding, requiring responses that demonstrated thorough understanding of both strategic planning and operational execution. As we discussed each element of the proposed restructuring, I found myself drawing on analytical skills and business knowledge that had been underutilized for years, but were perfectly suited for this type of complex problem-solving. Ms. Carter, this is exactly the kind of strategic approach to account management that we've been hoping to see from Summit Financial Services, Thomas said when I had finished presenting my proposed solutions. Your understanding of our operational needs and your ability to develop integrated solutions demonstrate the kind of professional competence that we require in our service relationships. His endorsement felt both professionally validating and personally meaningful, representing recognition from one of the industry's most respected executives that my capabilities aligned with the highest standards of business service delivery. As we concluded our meeting, Thomas requested that I serve as the primary coordinator for all aspects of his company's service relationship, a role that would significantly expand my responsibilities and establish me as the key liaison for Summit's most important client. The meeting concluded with handshakes, expressions of renewed confidence in our business relationship, and Thomas's commitment to providing positive feedback to Tom Garrison about the resolution of his concerns. As I escorted him and his assistant back to the elevators, I felt the satisfaction that comes from successfully handling challenging professional situations and delivering results that exceed client expectations. However, my sense of accomplishment was immediately challenged by Brenda's reaction to what she had observed. She approached me as soon as Thomas had departed, her expression reflecting anger and disbelief at what she clearly viewed as a serious breach of appropriate workplace protocols and authority boundaries. Linda, what did you think you were doing conducting an independent client meeting without supervision or authorization? Brenda demanded, her voice sharp with indignation and her posture aggressive in a way that suggested she viewed my actions as both insubordinate and potentially damaging to company operations. Her criticism felt particularly unfair given that I had successfully resolved serious client concerns that could have resulted in the loss of our most important account. The meeting had concluded with enhanced client satisfaction and expanded service commitments, representing exactly the kind of successful relationship management that should be recognized and supported rather than criticized. Thomas Whitfield arrived with urgent concerns that required immediate attention, I replied, calmly, maintaining professional composure despite my frustration with her continued attempts to undermine my authority and capabilities. I addressed his issues comprehensively and secured his commitment to expanded service relationships that will benefit both his company and Summit Financial Services. Brenda's expression suggested that my explanation had not satisfied her concerns about what she perceived as inappropriate assumption of authority and violation of established workplace hierarchies. You are not authorized to make commitments to clients or restructure account management without approval from qualified supervisors. Client relationship management requires oversight from people with appropriate credentials and experience. The irony of her statement was overwhelming, given that I possessed exactly the credentials and experience she was describing as necessary for client relationship management, and that my recent meeting had demonstrated successful application of those qualifications in resolving complex business challenges. But before I could respond to her continued dismissal of my capabilities, our conversation was interrupted by Michael's appearance in the reception area. "Linda, I understand Thomas Whitfield was here with some concerns about service coordination," Michael said, approaching with the kind of focused attention that suggested he had been informed about the client visit and was interested in understanding how the situation had been resolved. "How did the meeting go?" His inquiry provided an opportunity to report on the successful resolution of Thomas's concerns and the positive outcome of my independent client management. But it also meant that this conversation would take place in front of Brenda, whose criticism of my actions had just been explicitly contradicted by the CEO's apparent confidence in my ability to handle such situations independently. "The meeting went very well," I replied, maintaining eye contact with Michael while being aware of Brenda's increasingly uncomfortable expression. Thomas had legitimate concerns about coordination failures that were affecting service delivery. I was able to identify the root causes of the problems and develop a comprehensive restructuring plan that addresses his company's needs while improving our internal efficiency. Michael nodded approvingly, his expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and what appeared to be personal pride in my successful handling of a challenging situation. "Excellent. Thomas Whitfield is one of our most important clients, and maintaining his satisfaction is crucial for our continued growth. What kind of restructuring are you proposing?" As I outlined the account management changes I had developed during my meeting with Thomas, I could see Michael processing both the strategic soundness of my proposals and the sophisticated level of analysis they represented. His questions were insightful and demonstrated genuine interest in implementing solutions that would improve both client satisfaction and operational effectiveness. Brenda watched this exchange with growing agitation, clearly frustrated by Michael's positive response to my independent client management and his apparent intention to implement my recommendations without requiring additional oversight or approval from her supervisory authority. "Mr. Carter, I feel I should mention that Linda conducted this client meeting without proper authorization or supervision," Brenda interjected, her tone suggesting that she viewed Michael's approval of my actions as based on incomplete information about appropriate workplace protocols. Client relationship management should involve qualified supervisors to ensure that commitments and promises align with company capabilities and policies. Michael's expression shifted slightly, and I could see him processing Brenda's criticism, alongside his assessment of my successful resolution of Thomas's concerns. When he responded, his tone carried the kind of quiet authority that made his position on the matter unmistakably clear. "Brenda, Linda has an MBA in strategic management and 15 years of professional experience in client relationship management. She successfully resolved serious concerns from our most important client and developed solutions that will improve both service delivery and operational efficiency. That's exactly the kind of independent problem-solving and strategic thinking that we need from our client relationship manager. His defense of my qualifications and actions was both professionally appropriate and personally meaningful, establishing clear expectations about how qualified employees should be empowered to handle responsibilities within their areas of expertise. But his next statement would prove to be the catalyst for the most significant confrontation of my entire tenure at Summit Financial Services. In fact, Michael continued, I think Linda's successful handling of the Whitfield situation demonstrates that she's ready for expanded responsibilities. I'm promoting her to Senior Client Relationship Manager, effective immediately, with authority over all major account coordination and strategic relationship planning. The announcement was both thrilling and terrifying, representing professional advancement that exceeded my most optimistic expectations, while also escalating my workplace conflict with Brenda to a level that would likely require definitive resolution. I could see her processing the implications of my promotion, her expression reflecting anger, disbelief, and what appeared to be genuine panic about how these changes might affect her own position and authority. "This is ridiculous," Brenda exploded, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated frustration and perceived threats to her workplace status. You can't promote a receptionist to senior management just because she handled one client meeting. She doesn't have the experience, the qualifications, or the authority to manage strategic client relationships. The outburst was loud enough to attract attention from staff members throughout the reception area, creating exactly the kind of public confrontation that professional environments typically seek to avoid. Several people paused their activities to observe what was clearly becoming a significant workplace dispute, and I could feel the weight of their attention as the conflict escalated beyond anything that had occurred during my 8 years at Summit Financial Services. Michael's response was delivered with the kind of controlled authority that demonstrated his executive training and leadership experience. Brenda, Linda has consistently demonstrated analytical capabilities, strategic thinking, and professional competence that exceed the requirements for senior client relationship management. Her educational background and experience make her supremely qualified for expanded responsibilities. But Brenda seemed to have reached a point where professional restraint was no longer possible, and her next statement would reveal the depth of her resistance to recognizing my capabilities and accepting the changing workplace dynamics that Michael's leadership had introduced. "She's just a receptionist," Brenda shouted, her voice carrying throughout the reception area and ensuring that everyone present could hear her assessment of my professional worth and appropriate role within the company. "I don't care what degrees she claims to have or what meetings she conducts. She answers phones and schedules appointments. That's all she's qualified to do, and that's all she should be allowed to do." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft hum of office equipment and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Brenda's outburst had crossed professional boundaries and revealed attitudes toward employee worth and potential that were fundamentally incompatible with the organizational culture that Michael was working to establish. When Michael spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried unmistakable authority and finality. "Brenda, that attitude toward qualified employees is exactly what's wrong with outdated management approaches. Linda has an MBA from Northwestern University, 15 years of professional experience, and has just successfully resolved a crisis with our most important client. She is not just a receptionist, and referring to any employee in such dismissive terms is unacceptable." He paused, his gaze moving to include the staff members who had gathered to witness the confrontation. "Linda Carter is a highly qualified professional whose capabilities have been underutilized due to circumstances that prevented her from pursuing executive positions earlier in her career. Her promotion to Senior Client Relationship Manager is based entirely on merit, qualifications, and demonstrated performance." Michael's defense felt both professionally validating and personally moving. representing recognition and support that went beyond simple workplace advancement to encompass validation of my worth as a professional and as a person whose contributions deserved respect and appreciation. But what happened next would transform the entire dynamic of the confrontation and reveal the personal dimension that had been hidden beneath months of workplace tension and professional conflict. Furthermore, Michael continued, his tone shifting, to carry additional warmth and unmistakable pride. Linda Carter is my mother, and I'm incredibly proud of both her professional achievements and her personal strength in rebuilding her career after my father's death. She took a receptionist position to provide stability during a difficult time, but she never stopped being a talented, educated, accomplished professional who deserves recognition and advancement based on her qualifications. The revelation hit the assembled staff like a physical force, creating a moment of stunned silence as everyone processed the information that completely recontextualized every interaction they had witnessed between Michael and me over the past several weeks. Brenda stared at us with an expression of shock and dawning realization about the implications of her treatment of someone who was not only a qualified professional, but also the mother of the company's CEO. "That's impossible," Brenda whispered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to reconcile the family relationship with her established assumptions about my background and worth. "If she's your mother, why didn't you say something when I—" Her voice trailed off as she realized that completing that sentence would require acknowledging the dismissive and disrespectful treatment she had consistently displayed toward me, behavior that now appeared not only professionally inappropriate, but personally offensive to the executive who held ultimate authority over her continued employment. "Because," Michael replied with quiet intensity, "I wanted to see how Summit Financial Services treated qualified employees who weren't connected to executive leadership. I wanted to understand whether this company valued people for their capabilities and contributions, or whether advancement depended on politics and personal relationships." His explanation revealed that my situation had served as a test case for evaluating company culture and management effectiveness, and that Brenda's treatment of me had provided clear evidence about her leadership philosophy and her suitability for supervisory responsibilities. "What I discovered," Michael continued, "was that my mother, a highly qualified professional with an MBA and 15 years of experience, was consistently dismissed, undermined, and treated with disrespect by someone who couldn't recognize talent and capabilities when they were demonstrated daily for 8 years. The assessment was delivered with professional control, but unmistakable condemnation of management approaches that failed to recognize and utilize employee potential effectively. Around us, staff members watched with rapt attention as the workplace dynamics they had observed for years were suddenly reframed through the lens of family relationships and executive evaluation. Brenda seemed to realize that her position had become untenable, that her treatment of me now appeared as evidence of fundamental management failures that were incompatible with Michael's vision for company culture and employee development. Her next words came out as desperate justification rather than professional explanation. "I didn't know she was your mother," Brenda said, her voice rising with panic and indignation. "How was I supposed to treat her differently if I didn't know? About your relationship?" Michael's response cut through her attempted justification with surgical precision. "You weren't supposed to treat her differently because of our relationship. You were supposed to treat her with respect because she's a qualified professional who deserved recognition for her capabilities and contributions. The fact that you didn't recognize her worth says nothing about her qualifications and everything about your management failures." The confrontation had reached its climax, with Brenda's behavior exposed as fundamentally incompatible with professional standards and organizational values that Michael was determined to establish at Summit Financial Services. The gathered staff members seemed to understand that they were witnessing a defining moment in company culture and leadership philosophy. "Effective immediately," Michael announced, his tone carrying executive finality. "Brenda Mitchell's employment with Summit Financial Services is terminated." Her management approach and treatment of qualified employees is incompatible with our organizational values and professional standards. The dismissal was swift and decisive, representing both consequences for years of inappropriate behavior and a clear statement about expectations for employee treatment and professional respect. Brenda stared at Michael with disbelief, clearly struggling to process that her dismissive treatment of someone she considered unimportant had resulted in the end of her own career. "You can't fire me because I didn't know she was your mother," Brenda protested, her voice shrill with desperation and anger. "This is unfair retaliation for doing my job and maintaining appropriate workplace boundaries." Michael's final response demonstrated the kind of executive composure and strategic thinking that had earned him his position as CEO. "You're not being fired because Linda is my mother. You're being fired because you consistently failed to recognize and develop talent, treated qualified employees with disrespect, and demonstrated management failures that are incompatible with effective leadership and organizational success." As security escorted Brenda from the building, the reception area gradually returned to normal activity, though the atmosphere had been permanently transformed. Staff members approached me with expressions of respect, congratulations, and what appeared to be genuine excitement about the changes that were clearly coming to Summit Financial Services under Michael's leadership. Diane Reynolds was among the first to offer her congratulations, her warm smile reflecting both professional respect and personal happiness about my advancement. "Linda, I'm so proud of you. You've always demonstrated such competence and professionalism, and it's wonderful to see your qualifications finally recognized appropriately." Carol Peterson appeared beside us with official documentation for my promotion and salary adjustment, her expression reflecting satisfaction with organizational changes that better aligned employee capabilities with their responsibilities and compensation. "Linda, congratulations on your promotion to Senior Client Relationship Manager. Your new salary reflects the strategic importance of your role and your qualifications for executive-level responsibilities." The paperwork made everything official: a 60% salary increase, comprehensive benefits, executive office space, and authority over all major client relationships and strategic account development. After 8 years of underutilization and professional dismissal, I was finally being recognized and compensated according to my actual qualifications and contributions. As the afternoon progressed, Michael and I found ourselves alone in his office for the first time since the public revelation of our family relationship. The space felt different now that workplace boundaries had been transformed by acknowledged family connections and my advancement to executive-level responsibilities. "Mom, I'm sorry it took so long for this to happen," Michael said, his professional demeanor softening into the personal warmth that characterized our family relationship. "Watching someone treat you with such disrespect while you handled it with such grace and professionalism, it was both infuriating and inspiring." His words carried both personal affection and professional respect, acknowledging the complexity of our situation and the strength I had demonstrated in maintaining dignity despite years of underappreciation and dismissive treatment. "I'm proud of how you handled the entire situation," I replied, meaning every word. "You evaluated my qualifications fairly, provided opportunities for advancement based on merit, and established standards for employee treatment that will benefit everyone who works here." 6 months later, I sat in my corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, reviewing quarterly reports that showed significant improvements in client satisfaction, retention rates, and service quality since the implementation of integrated relationship management strategies. The Whitfield account had become a model for comprehensive service delivery, and several other major clients had requested similar coordination approaches based on their satisfaction with enhanced service quality. My role as Senior Client Relationship Manager had evolved beyond my initial expectations, encompassing strategic planning for client acquisition, development of service delivery protocols, and mentorship of junior staff members who were learning advanced relationship management techniques. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally fulfilling in ways that reminded me daily why I had originally pursued business education and strategic management specialization. Summit Financial Services had grown significantly under Michael's leadership, adding new clients, expanding service offerings, and developing a reputation for innovative approaches to client relationship management that other companies in the industry were beginning to study and emulate. The organizational culture had transformed from one that underutilized employee potential to one that actively sought to identify and develop capabilities throughout all hierarchy levels. The most satisfying aspect of my professional transformation wasn't the salary increase or the executive office space, though both were appreciated after years of financial concerns and workspace limitations. It was the daily opportunity to utilize my education, experience, and analytical capabilities in work that made meaningful contributions to organizational success and client satisfaction. Thomas Whitfield had become not just a satisfied client, but an advocate for Summit's approach to relationship management, referring other companies to our services and serving as a case study for how strategic coordination could transform business relationships. His enthusiastic endorsement had generated several major account acquisitions and established Summit Financial Services as a leader in comprehensive client service delivery. As I prepared to leave the office on a Friday evening in late spring, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from answering phones and being told I was just a receptionist to managing strategic relationships with the region's most important corporate clients. The transformation had required courage to claim my professional worth, persistence in demonstrating my capabilities, and the unexpected support of a son whose success had created opportunities for both personal and professional vindication. The view from my office window showed Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, just as it had from my reception desk for 8 years. But now the water seemed to reflect achievement and possibility rather than dreams deferred. The woman who had once been dismissed as incapable of strategic thinking was now developing innovative approaches to client relationship management that were being studied by industry professionals across the country. Michael appeared in my doorway as I was gathering my materials for the weekend, his expression carrying the mixture of professional respect and personal pride that had characterized our working relationship since the day he revealed our family connection to the entire company. "Mom, great work on the Morrison account proposal," he said, referencing the comprehensive service plan I had developed for a potential client whose business could represent significant growth opportunities for Summit Financial Services. The strategic analysis and implementation timeline demonstrate exactly the kind of thinking that sets our relationship management apart from our competitors. His praise felt both personally meaningful and professionally validating, representing recognition from someone whose business judgment I respected and whose opinion mattered to me both as his mother and as his colleague. The dual relationship had proven to be professionally beneficial rather than problematic, creating mutual accountability for excellence and shared commitment to organizational success. "Thank you," I replied, appreciating both his assessment of my work and his continued support for my professional development. It feels good to be working at a level that utilizes my actual capabilities and provides opportunities for strategic contribution. As we walked toward the elevators together, I thought about Brenda Mitchell, whose dismissive treatment and inability to recognize talent had ultimately cost her the career she had worked to build at Summit Financial Services. Her failure to see potential in qualified employees had revealed fundamental limitations in her management philosophy and her understanding of effective leadership principles. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to keep me in what she considered my proper place had ultimately led to my advancement to a position of greater authority and influence than she had ever achieved. Her cruelty had been transformed into opportunity. Her dismissal had become the catalyst for recognition, and her attempt to limit my potential had resulted in the full utilization of capabilities that had been dormant for too long. The elevator doors opened to reveal Marcus, the security guard who had greeted me warmly every morning for 8 years. His smile broadened when he saw Michael and me together, reflecting the genuine happiness that seemed to characterize most staff reactions to our family connection and my professional advancement. "Have a great weekend, Linda," Marcus said with obvious warmth. "Congratulations again on everything that's happened over the past few months. It's been wonderful watching you get the recognition you've always deserved." His words represented the support and validation I had received from colleagues who had witnessed my years of professional underutilization and were genuinely pleased to see my capabilities finally recognized and rewarded appropriately. The transformation had created positive changes throughout the organization, as Michael's leadership philosophy encouraged talent recognition and development at all levels. As Michael and I walked through the lobby of the building that had housed my professional life for nearly 9 years, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me from the humiliation of being called just a receptionist to the satisfaction of executive-level responsibility and recognition. The woman who had once been told to know her place had found her rightful position through the demonstration of capabilities that had been present all along, waiting for the right circumstances and leadership to recognize and utilize them effectively. The spring evening air carried the promise of summer as we emerged onto the Chicago streets, where the city's energy and optimism seemed to mirror my own sense of renewed purpose and professional fulfillment. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you opens the door to the best thing that was always meant to be yours. And sometimes the person who tries to diminish you inadvertently provides exactly the catalyst needed for you to claim your full potential. My story had begun with dismissal and developed through recognition, advancing from limitation to opportunity, and concluding with the kind of professional success that honors both capability and perseverance. The receptionist who had been told she was just anything had become the executive whose strategic thinking and relationship management were setting new standards for industry excellence. As Michael and I headed toward our respective cars in the parking garage, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had transformed professional humiliation into personal triumph, and for the family support that had made recognition and advancement possible when qualification alone had not been sufficient to overcome systematic underestimation and dismissive treatment. The future stretched ahead with the kind of promise that comes from knowing your worth and having it acknowledged by people whose opinions matter professionally and personally. After 8 years of being told I was just a receptionist, I had finally become exactly who I was always meant to be: a successful executive whose capabilities were recognized, whose contributions were valued, and whose potential was fully utilized in work that made meaningful differences for both clients and colleagues. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.